The Man with the Yin-Yang Eyes. Season 3. Episode 14. After a tiring night, bright dawn is probably the only thing that saves my mood. Wearily pulled Big D up. We both started to eat breakfast. Breakfast was great, but maybe because I was too tired, I didn't feel very good. According to what Leo had learned, the mage we were looking for was a native Aboriginal. His village was not far from here. Because it is the area of the indigenous people, they almost do not want outsiders to come to their area. This trip will certainly be difficult. Big D warned me in advance to prepare myself. As for me, I'm not afraid of difficulties. I just ask that I don't have to sleep with Big D anymore. After getting ready, we started to leave the house. Just a few steps out of the door, Big D looked at the house I had trouble with last night. Big D nudged me lightly and said, "Hey kid, it's already started. Hurry up and open your eyes." In front of me at this moment was an extremely strange but equally horrifying scene. In the morning sun, a long line of bodies was walking one after another. The strange thing is that these are all people who have died a long time ago, but all of them were able to walk normally as if they were still alive. Among the walking corpses, I immediately recognized the two bodies I had met last night, and now I could see them clearly. Maybe these are the parents of the man who chased me last night. Suddenly the car horn sounded. It turned out that Leo had been waiting for us in the car all this time. As soon as I got into the car, Big D said to me, "We don't know what difficulties we will encounter this time. Helping the other man bury his parents is a good deed for good luck. Let him try to make money. Never know when the soul of the deceased will truly rest." The car started rolling. Very quickly, the main roads were behind us. In front of us now is a trail leading deep into the forest. On this road, there are many potholes and small rocks scattered everywhere, making it difficult to move. Now I understand why Leo chose an SUV to take us. As we went deeper and deeper into the forest, now the traces of the roads also seemed to disappear. Without Leo, we certainly wouldn't know how to proceed. Passing through a clearing in the woods, we came to a fairly wide path. Suddenly I looked up at the cliff next to the road and couldn't help but be surprised. There seemed to be a lot of people standing on the cliff. Big D also glanced over and explained to me, "Look closely, kid, that's the cemetery of the people here. If you follow the group, you will eventually reach this place." After hearing what Big D said, I immediately fell silent to observe things more closely. The cliff next to the road is divided into many small cells, in which there are quite a few bodies arranged neatly next to each other. Since I had never heard of or seen this, it was very strange to me. Looking at the bodies on the cliff, I guessed that they had been dead for a long time, but the strange thing was that their clothes seemed to be quite new. At this time, Big D continued to speak. He explained that after burying his loved ones here, on major holidays, mages would come here and bring these bodies home. After returning, these bodies will be washed and changed into new clothes. After the holidays, the bodies are brought back here. Hearing what Big D said, I suddenly smiled, knowing how big the world was. Although we know that there are many strange and interesting things out there, if we do not witness it with our own eyes, we cannot believe it is true. The car continued to follow the trail and continued deeper into the forest. I guessed that I had already walked more than 10 miles about the time that passed. At this point, Leo spoke up. He said that it was almost there. From now on, we must listen to everything he said to avoid unnecessary trouble. We walked for about 5 more minutes, then the car stopped. Where we stopped was a craggy cliff. Leo then pointed to the gap in the valley and said that it was the village of the mage we were looking for. There was no road from here, so we had to walk. We took our things and got out of the car. Leo went ahead with a knife to clear everything in the way, he opened a small path for us to follow. As we walked, Leo told us that it was not far away, just going through this patch of forest to reach the other village. For Big D, carrying such a heavy body to walk in the forest is really not a good experience. Many times he slipped. Fortunately, I was able to catch him. While we were moving, suddenly Big D stopped and asked Leo, "Hey kid, according to what you said, the people here live exactly as their ancestors did in the past. Do they still eat humans now?" Hearing Big D's question, I guess he was looking at something on the ground. I immediately approached and realized why Big D was so surprised. On the ground right now is a human skull. Looking at its condition, the victim must have been dead for a long time. Also, from the large cracks on the skull, it is impossible to realize that the victim had an unpleasant death. Contrary to our attitude, Leo just laughed and said, "What's with the two of you being so surprised? It's just a skull. If you like, I'll pick up a few more for you." Hearing what Leo had just said, Big D became more and more worried. He kept complaining about the tribes that still refused to integrate into the civilized world until now. It is not known whether, among such tribes, anyone still keeps the custom of cannibalism. Just like that, Big D kept saying things that I thought were meaningless, and Leo and I just walked away silently, leaving Big D alone. Going a little further, suddenly Big D stopped for the second time. He immediately turned to me and asked, "Gregory, did you see what just flew by? I feel like it's like a dart." Feeling that Big D was too worried, I immediately reassured him. I said that it was probably just some kind of insect. While I was comforting Big D, suddenly a sharp spear came from nowhere, crashed into the tree right next to Big D, startling both of them. At this point, I also have to believe that what just flew past Big D was no ordinary insect. After a few seconds of standing still, looking at the trembling spear beside him, Big D suddenly shouted in surprise. Along with Big D's shout, a second spear also charged. This time it was many times more dangerous than the last time, just a little more, and it went through Big D's head like the way one takes a stick through a watermelon. I reacted immediately, grabbing the spear with one hand and pushing Big D down with the other to dodge. As soon as I grabbed the spear, the rustling sound of branches and leaves could be heard behind me. Without delay, I immediately grabbed Big D and dashed to the side, barely dodging the spears coming towards us. After dodging the dangerous attack, Big D and I immediately hid behind the big trees to avoid turning into two hedgehogs. While I poked my head out of the tree to observe, Big D beside me kept asking in a worried voice what I saw. Leo's voice rang out while we did not know what to do. He told us to stay here and not move. The locals here are just trying to scare away intruders from their territory. Hearing Leo's voice, Big D was no longer worried for his safety, instead of taking on an angry attitude. Big D then shouted, "Damn brat, why didn't you tell me about this in advance? Did you know we were almost dead? Quickly explain to the people here that we came here with no malicious intent, hurry up." After a few seconds of silence, I saw Leo begin to come out of hiding. Leo raised his hands above his head as he walked to show that he had no malicious intentions in coming in. At the same time, he shouted something out loud in the local dialect. After hearing what Leo said, a figure appeared in the distance and started walking towards us. Curious and also worried, I don't know if Leo will have any trouble. I immediately poked my head out of my hiding place to look ahead. The sight before me could not help but make me break out in a cold sweat. In front of us now are several Aboriginal people. Looking at their appearance and attire, I realized it's not much different from what I usually see in dramas. My first impression is that their appearance is quite similar. Everything they use is also extremely primitive and simple. After the Aborigines showed up, Leo shouted for us to come out. He also did not forget to tell us to step out slowly and raise our hands high for the Aboriginal people to see. Since Leo had told us to absolutely do what he said, we immediately slowly stepped out of our hiding place. After Leo explained our purpose in coming to this village, the locals were no longer as hostile as they were at first. However, they remained very vigilant the rest of the way. Just to be sure, Big D still didn't let go of his hand, like he was afraid that when he lowered his hand, dozens of spears around would immediately pierce him.